And then again, I'm Richard Tsai. Before we get started, I do want to review a few housekeeping items so I can let you know how to participate in today's web event. What you see on the screen right now is a control panel. It's the master control for the webinar. If you click on that button on the top left, the orange arrow, you can open and close your panel. That's the audio pane right there. You have the flexibility to either join the webinar via microphone and speakers, or by telephone. There is a Q&A question box here. At the end of the presentation, we will do a Q&A session to answer questions from the audience. At any point during this webinar, feel free to type a question in as we go along and click send, and we'll try to address as many questions as we have time for at the end. Also, you can raise your hand. So during the presentation, we may ask you to, and this option is available here. And last but not least, today's webinar is being recorded, so you can review this later or share it with a colleague. Everyone who is participating today will receive an email with the link to this recording, I believe, in about 48 hours or so. Okay, so with that said, why don't we get started? I'll let that sink in for a little bit. But 2011 was definitely a bull market for data theft. Digital information theft is commonplace today, and this just so happens to be the world that we now live in. So let's go over a little bit about 2011 very quickly. McAfee did a report that indicated in the first half of 2011 that it was actually the busiest in identifying malware, where there were, approximately over 12 million different malware samples around, which was a big increase over the previous year, actual 0.2% increase. A phishing activities trends report actually showcased that malware had reached an all-time high in the first half of 2011, where half of those malwares that were detected were actually, 50% of those, half of those were actually compromised, caused a compromise. The Ponemon Institute did a report and indicated that 64% of organizations acknowledged that networks really aren't any more secure in 2011 as they were compared to 2010. Also from McAfee, in another report from them, 79% of organizations experienced a significant security incident in the past 12 months. And this is just, we're just quickly kind of going through a summary of 2011. There obviously were a number of high-profile incidents that occurred across some pretty large companies and well-known companies, bringing data breaches to the forefront of, what we're concerned about here in today's society. Starting off with, RSA having their secure IDs being compromised, which actually led to a data theft compromise at Lockheed Martin. Of course, there's HP Gary Federal, where Anonymous actually attacked them in retaliation to something that Aaron Burr had done. At 178.com, an online gaming company in China, there were over 40 million records compromised. We all won't forget about Sony Online Entertainment and the PlayStation Network, where a series of attacks led to the loss of over, tallied over 100 million different customer records. There was a huge email records breach at Epsilon, tallying around 80 million early last year. Valve has an online gaming house, something called the Steam database, and there was a breach there of over 35 million credit card records. And the list goes on. Obviously, this isn't all of it, and it's not intended to list every possible breach, but it simply highlights that this is the world we live in. Last but not least, there was Liza Moon. There was Virginia Commonwealth University, which had the largest data breach for a university in the past year, and there was Anonymous, low-sec, anti-sec, organizations that made it to front-page headlines and actually really brings to the forefront in our society today. So there's no question that the database is the target of attack. That's where the valuable information is stored. And unfortunately, databases themselves holding this information do have vulnerabilities. Team Shatter, which is part of application security, is a database security research team, as well as others across the industry, continue to find high-risk vulnerabilities in databases, and they submit them to database vendors to patch. When database vendors actually do patch their applications, within a short period of time, sometimes within hours, exploit scripts for these vulnerabilities are actually posted onto the internet right after a patch release is produced. And the reason that happens is, most vulnerabilities are, kept responsibly, try to be kept in secret so they're not passed on to malicious hackers. But once patches are actually produced and released to the general public by database vendors, very quickly, the underground part of the industry, there's a lot of work that goes on where, black hats are looking at the patches, finding information about these vulnerabilities that they probably weren't aware of before, and they're going to work on them. So, it creates this window of opportunity for malicious attackers to go after databases where a patch was just released. So when you take that into account, most organizations, when surveyed, takes on average about 9 months to deploy a database patch. Creating this window of opportunity for hackers to get access to the database. Databases themselves are complex applications. They can be misconfigured, for their security settings, making them an easy target. Database attacks typically bypass encryption, as well as traditional intrusion prevention mechanisms, and that's why we're kind of here today. So as we'll see, most database attacks are not deterred by database encryption technologies. So let's talk a little bit about crypto and the solutions for databases. We're going to be focusing on encryption and masking. Encryption is based on mathematical algorithms that make it mathematically impossible to unlock the data, to get access to the data. So in order to be able to get access to encrypted data, you need a key. Masking is different. Masking is a substitution algorithm that permanently modifies the data. So we're going to focus on talking about 3 types of database encryption and 2 types of database masking. 3 types of database encryptions we'll go through are network encryption, file disk encryption, as well as column and full database encryption. And there are 2 types of database masking that we'll kind of touch upon, which is static data masking and dynamic data masking. So let's talk about encryption. So on the screen is a simple illustration of a typical application. If you look at the screen now from left to right, we have authorized application users that connect and use the application, which is serviced by the application server. The application server itself is connected to the database, where it accesses and stores information such as sensitive data. The database is connected to some type of storage, typically a disk, that physically houses that information. Also connecting to the database typically are your users on the bottom left, are your DBAs, administrators for databases, whose job it is to ensure that a database is performing well. So any examples I'm going to show you on the following screens, we're going to use the locks which are indicated below to indicate, a lock will showcase where encryption is being placed, and if it's unlocked, it just means it's non-encrypted. So let's take a look at the various database encryption technologies and how they help protect the data from application users and DBAs. First, we'll look at network encryption, which is about data in transit. And what I mean about data in transit, it's about the data that's on the move. So when you apply database encryption, you'll see your locks there, which indicate that pathway between the application server to the database, as well as the DBAs to the database, are encrypted. It means the data on the move will be encrypted. And typically, when we talk about that, usually that's some form of SSL technologies or HTTPS. So when you actually when you apply network encryption, that doesn't apply to these areas on the screen, which is in reference to application server, DBAs, storage, the database itself, those are still all in the clear. Those aren't encrypted. So the benefit of actually having network encryption in place is that it's really securing the network links. So it stops attackers who are on that network and can actually, sniff the network. So it stops them from being able to steal data by monitoring that network link. What network encryption doesn't do, it doesn't protect you from any type of, standard application access. We're looking at the application user, users going through the application server. It doesn't prevent SQL injection. It doesn't prevent DBAs who have access to the database, and it doesn't prevent media backup theft. So network encryption doesn't do that. Next, let's look at file disk encryption. This is about encrypting the storage so that the disk itself is fully encrypted. What it means is that what's still in the clear is the application server, the database itself. None of that is encrypted. In file disk encryption, the objective is to put encryption on the storage on the disk itself. So the files on a disk are encrypted. That stops attackers from stealing data by taking the physical media itself or backups from that storage device itself. So the objective is to prevent someone walking away with the disk and trying to, because it's encrypted. And hopefully when that's done, the keys, the encryption keys themselves aren't stored on the same disk. But the objective there is if you physically steal the disk, it will be encrypted. And again, in this example, with file and disk encryption, it doesn't provide any protection from your standard application access. It doesn't prevent SQL injection. It doesn't prevent DBAs from accessing the database, and it doesn't stop any type of malicious user doing some form of network monitoring. The third form of encryption is either column-level encryption or the full database encryption. What that means is encryption is applied to the database itself, meaning specifically related to columns, and the database itself gets encrypted. When you encrypt there at the database, you do also get a benefit of encrypting at storage too, because the data itself is not stored in the clear. It's stored in some form of ciphertext, which always requires a mathematical algorithm to decrypt before it's presented back to the person who's trying to access it. Standard about this is your application users will have that are authorized in order to get access to the information in the database. They can do so as long as they've been given the keys, which is typical because you encrypt the database, but of course there is an application that is using the database. It typically is given the encryption keys because they're the authorized users into the database to be able to access that information. They're given encryption keys so that they can decrypt the information from the database so it can be presented and used for its valid business usage. DBAs are intended not to be able to see the data within the database because their job is really about performance and upkeep of the system. So data, again, is stored inside the database. It protects the database from all unauthorized DBA access or direct access, and protection from backups and protects the physical media. The unfortunate part about this is majority of times when database encryption at the column or the full database encryption is set up, DBAs tend to actually set that up so they actually have the encryption keys in most cases, thereby giving them authority to get access to the data still, so not actually preventing one of the key use cases from preventing DBAs from accessing the data itself. So here with this type of situation, with database encryption, you're still not protected from application access because the application needs to get access to the data, so it doesn't stop SQL injection or some form of network monitoring, sniffing of the network traffic itself. And protection from DBAs is sometimes minimal if it's not set up correctly. In majority of cases that you typically see when you apply this form of encryption is that DBAs actually get access to the keys. So thereby nullifying the crypto that you try to put in place on them. Okay, so those are the 3 different types of database encryption. On the screen here is a matrix of those database encryption technologies and the protection that they offer. My focus here is really centered around DBA access, or you can call them the privileged user, and application access. Given that encryption is an important part of security and that it comes with great cost and complexity, I'm highlighting you down to the bottom right of the screen on this particular matrix, is that even when taking all 3 types of database encryption technologies, and they do come at a pretty hefty cost and complexity, is that they do offer protection for network monitoring. They do offer protection for media theft or backup theft. But unfortunately, it's not necessarily covering your cases when you have to deal with DBA access and application access. So even when you put encryption in place for this, you're still subject to not having protection for DBAs as well as standard application access. Talk a little bit about data masking, and there's really 2 types. So we'll focus here on static data masking. When you hear masking, it's typically mostly in reference to static data masking, which is a test data management solution, and it doesn't apply to production systems. It's really focused on test systems. Organizations tend to keep development and test copies of their production applications. So masking replaces the real production data in those test and development systems with made-up data, with data from production that's substituted and scrambled so that it's made up to look like real data, so it can be used for application development testing. It's all made up, so it doesn't need to be protected from some form of loss. And what that's really doing is it's really for the protection against malicious testers and developers. Dynamic data masking is a new and emerging technology. Unlike static masking, dynamic data masking is for production environments. It substitutes information on the fly by defining access controls. So that's good stuff. It's a technology to compensate for existing applications that weren't properly built with security controls in place to prevent access to sensitive data. So we've kind of discussed a little bit of various forms of encryption and masking and how they don't completely solve the problem with respect to DBAs and application access, but all isn't lost. So how do you secure your databases? The way we look at it is we really do recommend a continuous monitoring lifecycle for securing databases. It's really about discovering your databases, understanding where they are, locating the sensitive data, preventive measures by scanning and fixing vulnerabilities, scanning and fixing privileges, auditing real-time access, and then responding to abuse. Discovering of databases and locating sensitive data, it's really about understanding, building out an inventory of your environment, knowing where all your databases are so that you know what security controls to put around them, because you'll know exactly what type of sensitive data is in them, and having policies in place to put the appropriate security controls depending on the tier or level of the application itself. And then periodically going back and performing discoveries against your environment to see if any new databases have been installed on the network, so that you can always keep a fresh inventory of databases, so you can always determine whether security controls need to be applied. You need to scan and fix vulnerabilities on your database systems, identifying a baseline secure configuration in the system itself allows you to compare all your databases to see where you need to apply resources to correct issues within the database. So by scanning your databases, you can typically get a complete list of issues at the database. You can drill down into the gory details of each and every database, and get details so you can schedule times to remediate it. But besides the system itself, you also want to scan and fix privileges on the database itself. So focusing on users and data in the database. So focusing on users and object access, you do want to know who has access to what and how they did get that access, so you can actually ensure that you are practicing restricted access in your database environment, so that you can start to eliminate any avenues of attack. By identifying the privileged users, effectively not just the administrators or ones that are defined as DBAs, identifying the privileged activities that users do have on the system, so that you can start to weed out and make sure restricted access is practiced. Not least, you do want to audit access in real time, understanding who accessed what and when, who made what changes and when. So typically that entails having real-time monitoring activity for CDL statements, DCL statements, following access to sensitive data, which are DML statements, as well as select queries into sensitive data. Consider separation of duties, where we can't put people you are auditing in charge of the audit system itself, ensuring that the third-party audit system is governed not by the database groups themselves. Once you have real-time audit access, you can get alerts and details on changes as they happen, and then be able to respond to them. When alerts do show up on a system, you do want to consider some form of active response, some automated incident response process to determine how you want to address a real-time event that requires intervention. Real-time responses can take on the form of blocking or a number of different items based on the approach that you do want to take. Different responses should consider the different types of risks and implement an appropriate countermeasure. And with that said, we do have an obligatory slide about application security. We do have two different product lines that are focused on helping provide protection measures for the database itself. We do have a product called App Detective Pro that's focused on project-based database security assessments geared at auditors and IT advisors and consultants. And we do have a product line called DB Protect, which is focused on operational continuous monitoring for IT security and database professionals. For more information about what we discussed here today, I invite you to check out our Team Shadow website. You can get access to the top 10 database vulnerabilities. My good colleague Joshua, they write a book on practical Oracle security you can actually take a look at. And that really concludes our discussion here today about database encryption. Jeff, I'd like to open up the forum for questions if they've been coming in.
Hey, Rich. Thanks. Thank you very much. All right. So why don't we kick off with a few questions, and we'll address the first one. We get this a lot, and it's around access to the presentation. Will this be actually available to folks? And the answer is yes. Will we actually be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar within about 24 to 48 hours after the session concludes? So just look for that email from us, and you'll be able to go ahead and watch this on demand, or forward off to any colleague that might want to watch this. Now, if you do have any questions, make sure to go into the questions and answers box and go ahead and type in your question there, and we will try to go ahead and get to that. So we're going to get to Another question here. Could you tell me the difference between masking and encryption?
The difference between masking and encryption, is that what you said?
Yes.
We went over some of that in the previous slides, and they are two different types of technologies, and I'll kind of try to recap it very quickly. Encryption is a well, first of all, the technologies. Encryption is a mathematical algorithm that makes it near impossible to get access to the data unless you actually have a key. But its intended use is really for encrypting on the storage, on the database itself, or on the network. In all those cases, they are applied for very specific use cases, whether it's good for data at rest, which will prevent any type of media, which will prevent media theft, or the disk theft. On the database itself, if encryption is applied on the database itself, it helps to prevent someone from accessing the sensitive data if they don't have the key. Masking is typically a different solution that's really intended, and when I say masking, it's usually in reference to static data masking, which is really intended to prevent application developers and QA testers and having sensitive data sitting around in QA and test environments. Because if you have the sensitive data in those environments, then they are also subject to the same regulations and security controls that you need to have in place, because sensitive data is in those specific environments. So static data masking is really intended to make sure that data isn't in those environments by making sure when you take production copies of data, placing them into QA or test environments, that the data gets scrubbed, it gets scrambled in a way, and the sensitive data is substituted with something that looks like real data, but it is not. So I hope
that sounds great. So when we go to the next question, so if encryption is not enough, what do you recommend? Are you suggesting that masking is a better solution, or are there other solutions that you would recommend?
No, I'm not suggesting that they aren't good solutions at all, actually. I think encryption and masking are necessary solutions. The point we were trying to make here in today's presentation is that they have specific purposes in what they prevent. But at the same time, they don't necessarily prevent access from an application or from DBAs themselves. And what I'm suggesting to deal with that is implementing a vulnerability management program, an access certification program around your databases, as well as implementing real-time activity monitoring to complement encryption and masking. Because all of these different technologies do solve one part of the database security problem. So I'm not suggesting don't use encryption, don't use masking. I think they are very good technologies, but you have to understand that they're intended for they're protecting certain types of theft related to media and related to test and QA environments. But there are different types of controls that you also need to consider for production environments.
Okay, great. Next question, Rich, is how do you feel about using PGP as an encryption tool?
For databases? That's probably going to be
if it's appropriate for databases, or if it's not, or
I don't know if it's appropriate for databases. I don't know if it's practical for databases, and I'm not aware of a solution that's going to work in that manner. In using both a public and private key pair for the database. I mean, I'm sure there are certain situations where it makes sense, but I'm not sure it's always the most practical solution. Remember, when we're talking about encryption, it's really about it's really about the prevention of access to sensitive data within the database. So there's always a group of folks that there's always a group of users that need access to the data. So there's always your typical access controls that you put in place. You put encryption in place, which is one step above access controls, but the benefit of that is it keeps things encrypted on the database as well as the data storage, so that if someone were to steal the data files for the database, you would be safe. You would be relatively safe from that because that stuff is encrypted. Unless you have the key, you won't have access to it. So again, encryption has specific usage in terms of what it protects the database from, but it's it's good technology, but it's not everything that needs. It's not everything.
Yeah, and I think also related to that question about what where things are limited. This other question kind of comes in around what about email messages and encryption, and what protection is offered by this encryption? I think really the answer to that really revolves around today we're not really discussing email encryption. It's all about the data in the database. The email encryption around emails is all, I mean, that's a completely different technology. I don't know if Rich, you want to just touch quickly on that before we move on to the next question, but
yeah,
looking at the data,
I think, yeah, you've kind of addressed it there. That isn't the domain of what we're discussing here. So I'll pass on the question for email encryption.
Great, and so this question's around the database and application. So the questions, my impression is your products focus on the database setup, configuration, enroll errors, and vulnerabilities. How do your products address the issues of any inappropriate access from the application layer?
From the application layer, when we talk about the
application, your application is actually accessing the databases and addressing those vulnerabilities. Since we know we have lots of users accessing applications, accessing the database. What about the application? How do we prevent inappropriate access, at the application?
In our current product set today with App Protector Pro and DB Protect, we deal with applications primarily by looking at the database. That's the philosophy of application security. Us, the company that's giving this presentation today. So our focus, obviously, in today's presentation is looking at the database because that is a critical stack that's part of the application. Most enterprise applications do consist of multiple tiers, which includes the application server layer as well as the database layer supporting it. And our focus here in the product set that I briefly presented, DB Protect, is focused on the database layer because that's where actually all the data is stored. So the security controls that we're talking about in protecting the database is focused there, and not necessarily at the application layer itself, but it is in support of it and complementary to anything that you do want to do at the application layer itself.
Yeah, I think we have time for 2 more questions, and whatever we don't go ahead and answer, we will go ahead and follow up with you after the webinar. So what is your best practice that you've shared? What recommendations do you have for managing shared admin accounts to the database?
I wouldn't recommend shared admin accounts at the database at all. It's definitely security best practice not to have shared accounts. Shared accounts certainly contributes to the problem. Really do need to give responsibility and authority to the folks that are accessing the database. I strongly suggest trying not to use shared accounts. And certainly if you do, it makes very good sense to have some type of real-time activity monitoring in place to identify when when those shared accounts are used, so that you have a running audit trail of it, as well as having paired up with some type of operating system audit trail with that. At the same time, if you're using shared accounts, it's probably always good to do some level of access certification on those shared accounts so that you understand exactly what all the privileges are, all the different entitlements in those shared accounts, and who has access to those shared accounts. But we certainly know that shared accounts are used heavily in practice, but it certainly goes against what would be considered a security best practice. We would certainly try to eliminate the shared account usage.
Great. All right, so we have we'll ask one last question, and then we'll wrap up the session. So, in terms of priorities for database encryption, what would be those priorities? What, in your opinion, Rich, according to the most recent threats that databases are facing?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I'm not sure how to answer that question specifically, but in some cases, like I said, it really depends. It really depends on you guys and what you're trying to protect against. If your focus is on theft related to media and storage, then encryption probably should be at the top of the priority. But if your focus is on DBAs or application access, then I would strongly suggest looking at a program for continuous monitoring. And also, unfortunately, the world we live in today is like the threats out there are real. Most times you'll need to implement all of these different types of technologies in order to really have the appropriate security controls in place. But it's a difficult question to answer without knowing what everyone's specific use case is.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much today, Rich, for providing us a valuable input on database encryption. Again, we'll be sending out a link to the recording within about 24 to 48 hours. And if in the meantime you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to send Rich an email or send us an email at sales@appsecinc.com, and we will make sure someone gets back in touch with you. Again, have a great day, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Jeff.